The fleet moved like a shining storm across the black sea of stars, a formation of steel giants carrying the pride of the galaxy. They were the strongest warships built in centuries, engines burning like blue fire weapons locked and ready as if daring the darkness to come closer. The crew believed this was only a patrol mission, nothing more than a quiet watch at the edge of known space. But beyond them stretched the dark expanse, a silent region where signals died and no ship dared to linger for long. Some called it cursed. Some called it empty space, but the fleet sailed forward with confidence, thinking nothing could stop them. The commanders trusted the technology, the soldiers trusted their training, and the galaxy trusted them. It was supposed to be routine. The reports back to Central Command were clear, nothing unusual. No signs of enemy activity. The colonies could rest easy, knowing the strongest shield of mankind was on duty. Then came the first silence. One ship failed. To report in, the commander thought it was a system error, maybe a comms relay failing in the distance, but moments later another ship fell silent, and then another. The fleet was shrinking without battle, without warning, and no distress calls reached. The flagship-only static voices, once so steady, now drowned in whispers of fear. The last clear message was carried across the void, a voice raw with panic. Someone screaming, "They are here," before the transmission broke into sharp static like claws. Across the speakers, the flagship sent urgent pings, desperate for reply. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the expanse and the distant hum of their own dying comms systems. One by one, ships vanished from the radar as if pulled out of existence. The fleet was falling apart, but no explosions were seen. No wreckage floated behind them. It was as if something invisible was swallowing them whole. Panic spread through the crews. Inside, the remaining ship's corridors echoed with footsteps of soldiers. Trying to stay calm, engineers worked furiously, trying to trace the strange energy interference, but readings made no sense. Patterns shifted like shadows across their screens. The commander ordered the fleet to regroup, to fire weapons into the darkness. But what target could they strike? There was only void and silence until strange signals began to pour into their sensors. Not human, not mechanical, but alive sounds like whispers crawling through every frequency, low, deep, almost like voices pressing into their minds. Some crew fell to their knees, clutching their heads as if the signals were inside their skulls. The commander gave the order to retreat. Engines burned at full power, but then systems started failing. Lights dimmed across corridors. Shields flickered. Power drained as though the stars themselves were being swallowed. One soldier tried to send a final personal message to his family, but the message only recorded static. His tears mixed with fear as the ship trembled around him. The void outside pulsed with something unseen, shadows bending space in ways no machine could explain. Screens shattered alarms, screamed men and women, cried out until one last transmission escaped, a fragment carried across light years warning nothing. But silence after. Back in the heart of the galaxy, Central Command received the broken message. They played it again and again, the voice shouting, "They are here." Before the sound cut into a hollow hiss, leaders sat in silence staring at the screens. Knowing the truth but afraid to speak it publicly, they told the citizens it was an accident, a malfunction in the fleet's engines. They said no enemy existed. They said the patrol was routine and safe. But fear is a fire that spreads faster than lies. Families of the soldiers demanded answers. Colonies whispered of cover-ups, and rumors began to grow that something darker had been found, something so dangerous the fleet never stood a chance. The galaxy wanted answers, but command offered none. They hid the truth behind walls of secrecy, locking the files deep within archives, while the whispers continued across stations and colonies. The fleet that never returned had become a ghost story. But some said they could still hear echoes in the transmissions drifting in space, faint voices lost in the dark, calling for help that would never come. The galaxy could not rest. Not until the question was answered what happened to the fleet, and what had they seen in the shadows of the dark expanse. For now, there was only silence, only fear, and a story that had just begun. The news of the vanished fleet spread across the galaxy like a storm that no one could stop, even though the Central Command tried to seal the truth behind official reports. And carefully written statements, whispers had already taken shape, and whispers travel faster than any starship. Families of the lost soldiers gathered in protest outside government stations, holding pictures of their sons and daughters and demanding to know why they had not returned. Colonies on the edge of known space burned with anger because they were promised protection, and now the very shield of the galaxy had disappeared without a trace. Journalists tried to ask questions, but every question was met with silence or with the same words repeated again and again. Technical failure, mechanical breakdown, no survivors. But no one believed it, and in the quiet corners of the galaxy, ordinary people began to share their own theories. Some said the fleet was destroyed by aliens hiding beyond the dark expanse. Others believed the fleet had betrayed the galaxy and crossed into forbidden space, never to come back, and there were darker whispers that the commanders of the fleet had seen something they were never meant to see and were erased to protect a secret. The fear grew stronger because the silence after the last transmission felt unnatural. Too clean, too sharp, as if something alive had cut through the signals. The people of the galaxy could not sleep, knowing that hundreds of ships and thousands of soldiers had simply vanished, and all that remained was a broken voice crying, "They are here," before dissolving into static, far from the centers of power. A young investigator named Kyle worked for an independent news circle not controlled by the government. He had no rank, no influence, but he had a sharp mind and a hunger for the truth. Kyle had always been drawn to mysteries, especially the ones the leaders tried to hide. When he first heard about the vanishing, he knew there was more behind it than a failed engine or broken machinery. He began searching the data archives for records from the fleet's last known path. Many files were locked, but he found fragments scattered across forgotten servers, strange energy readings that had no explanation, signals that did not match any human technology. Kyle's hands shook as he stared at the numbers because they showed patterns almost like voices hidden inside the static. Kyle sent messages to his network, but most of them warned him to stop. They said the government had already silenced others who asked too many questions. They said curiosity could kill faster than warships, but Kyle did not stop. Instead, he traveled to the outer colonies where people claimed they had seen lights in the sky near the time of the vanishing. He listened to farmers, miners, and traders who lived near the edge of the dark expanse. Their stories were rough, but they all carried the same shape ships that glowed like broken stars, shadows bending in space lights that died as if the stars themselves were swallowed. Some spoke of a sound that came through their comms at night, a low hum almost like breathing. And when Kale compared their stories to the energy readings, he felt his heart freeze because the timelines matched. Meanwhile, inside Central Command, officials gathered behind locked doors. The highest-ranking voices debated in anger. One side demanded the truth be revealed, so the galaxy could prepare. But the other side warned that revealing the truth would spread panic and chaos, and if panic spread, then entire colonies could break away from the alliance, and the galaxy would collapse from within. They chose silence. They chose the cover story, but silence cannot erase fear, and fear continued to spread. Back in his small quarters, Kale stared at the recordings again and again. The whispers inside the static seemed to grow louder each time, as though something was trying to speak to him. One night as he listened, the pattern shifted, forming strange symbols across his screen. His computer shook, lights flickered, and for a moment Kale swore he heard words in a voice that was not human, not mechanical, but alive. It said, "Not safe." And then the screen went black. Kale sat frozen, breathing hard. He knew then that the fleet had not simply died. Something had reached them, something beyond human understanding, and now he felt it had reached him too. Across The galaxy protests turned to riots. People shouted in the streets, demanding answers, while military patrols moved to silence them. News channels avoided the story, but the name of the lost fleet burned across the stars like a wound every citizen. Every soldier, every child wanted to know what had happened. And in the shadows, Cale realized he could not stop searching, because the truth was already pulling him deeper into the darkness of the expanse. And the silence left by the fleet was no longer empty. It was filled with something waiting, something watching, and the galaxy could sense it even if they had no name for it yet. The investigation that Cale had begun in secret soon turned into an obsession. He could not eat, he could not sleep. His mind circled only one question: what had the fleet seen before it disappeared? He carried the fragments of data with him everywhere. His old worn tablet glowing with numbers and broken recordings that no one else seemed to care about. He tried to share them with other reporters, but most refused even to look at the files. They feared the government. They feared the silence that followed when people asked too many questions. Cale understood their fear, but he also knew that the galaxy was walking blind into something far greater than a simple mystery, and he was determined to find the path, no matter the cost. Through his contacts in the colonies, Cale heard of a salvage crew that had discovered wreckage drifting near the border of the dark expanse. The government claimed there was nothing but empty space in that region, yet here was a group of independent salvagers. Claiming they had pulled a broken escort vessel out of the shadows, Cale bribed his way onto their ship, and when he stepped into the damaged corridors of the vessel, he felt the air grow heavy, as though the ship itself carried the weight of what had happened. The walls were scorched, the metal twisted not by weapons, but by something that seemed to burn from the inside out. Consoles were melted frozen in positions that made no sense, like shapes had bent and folded without fire, and in the command deck, the chairs still held the marks of crew that had never escaped. Cale found the black box buried in the remains, a small cube half-crushed but still alive with fragments of memory. When he activated it, the ship's last moments returned. In broken flashes, the crew shouting alarms, screaming about power drains. Then a sound so strange it made Cale shiver, a low chorus. Not machine, not human. Almost like voices layered on top of each other, whispering words no one could understand, and in the final seconds of the recording, shapes flickered across the corridor walls, shadows that did not belong to any crew. Cale stopped the recording, his heart pounding because he knew he had just heard what the fleet had faced. The salvage crew wanted to sell the wreckage for parts, but Cale convinced them to keep quiet, at least for now. He promised them credits and safety, though deep down he knew he could not protect anyone from whatever force had swallowed the fleet. He smuggled the black box back to his quarters and spent nights analyzing the signal. Each time the whispers grew clearer. Each time the shadows seemed closer. His room filled with static, until sometimes it felt like the walls were breathing with him. He began to see figures in the corner of his eyes, flickers of movement when no one else was there. Word of his discovery spread quickly. In hidden channels, a small group of scientists reached out to him. People who had been exiled for speaking truths. The government did not want to hear. They told Cale that similar signals had appeared in ancient data centuries ago near forgotten ruins at the edge of mapped space, always dismissed as noise, always erased from records. But now, with the fleet gone, they believed. The truth was breaking through. One scientist explained that the patterns inside the static were not random. They were a form of communication, but not directed at machines, directed at minds. Cale felt the chill settle deep in his bones as he realized. The crew of the fleet had not only seen something, they had heard it inside their heads. Meanwhile, the government tightened its grip across the galaxy. They declared the salvage of wreckage illegal. They erased Cale's name from news networks, labeling him a traitor and a liar. But this only made his recordings spread faster across underground channels. Citizens shared them in secret, listening to the whispers in the dark. Many claimed they heard words inside the static, calling their names, begging for help. Others said it felt like something was watching them through the sound. The panic grew, and with it the cracks in the government's control. Cale decided he had to return to the Expanse, not with soldiers, not with fleets, but with those. Willing to face the truth, he joined with the scientists and the salvagers. Forming a small, desperate team, they carried old ships patched together with stolen parts and ventured into the edge of the silence, where the fleet had last been seen as the darkness swallowed them. Their sensors began to fail. The stars faded one by one until only the shadows remained, their radios filled with whispers once again, and the static formed shapes across their screens, the same shapes Kyle had seen before. Deep in his mind, Cale felt the presence pressing closer, as though something vast and unseen had noticed him. His heart pounded, but he could not turn back, because now he knew the secret the government feared to reveal. The fleet had not been destroyed by enemies in battle. They had been consumed by something older, something that reached into minds and fed on the silence itself. Cale looked out at the endless void and felt the truth growing heavier with every passing second. The fleet that never returned had not died alone. They had been the first warning of what was coming for the rest of the galaxy. The deeper Cale and his small team drifted into the dark expanse. The more unnatural the space around them felt, stars that should have been visible were simply gone, erased, as if an unseen curtain had been pulled across the galaxy. Sensors blinked in and out, not from damage, but from interference that no machine could explain. The salvagers whispered nervously in the corridors of their patched ship, while the scientists tried to hold on to reason scribbling data that twisted into meaningless loops. Cale stood at the main viewport, watching the void fold and unfold like a living thing, his chest heavy with the memory of the black box recording and the voices that had crawled into his dreams every night since. Their navigation finally brought them to a derelict station hidden deep in the expanse, a structure so old it seemed more like a fossil than a machine, its surface scarred with time but still glowing faintly as if pulsing with a heartbeat. No one aboard could identify its design. It was not human, not built by any known civilization. The station drifted silently, turning slowly against the void, and as their ship docked, Cale felt the air grow colder inside the station. The walls were etched with symbols worn down by centuries, and the corridors stretched in strange angles that made his eyes ache as though space itself bent around the architecture. They moved carefully through the shadows, carrying lanterns that flickered against walls covered in carvings. The scientists pressed their hands to the markings, whispering translations pieced together from old records and forgotten ruins. The words spoke of an ancient war, a war not against armies of flesh and blood, but against a swarm without form, a hunger that moved from star to star, consuming light and mind alike. The carvings named it the Silent Swarm, a name that made Cale's skin crawl. One wall showed a fleet like theirs swallowed whole, while another showed a shadow breaking across a galaxy until every star dimmed into silence. At the center of the station, they found a chamber filled with broken consoles and faded holograms. Cale wiped the dust away, and one console sparked alive, flickering to reveal records in a language half understood, half guessed. The scientists struggled to piece the meaning together, but one truth shone clear. The swarm had been here before, long before humans reached. The stars, long before colonies rose and governments took power, and every record warned of the same thing. The swarm could not be fought with weapons. It could only be avoided, hidden from, or sealed away, and every civilization that had tried to resist had vanished into the same silence the fleet had already met. Cale felt the room tighten as they absorbed the truth, but one scientist pointed to the last part of the record, which spoke not of destruction, but of captivity. It suggested the swarm was not free. It was chained, contained in the depths of the expanse by forces unknown but weakening over time. And if the fleet had vanished, it meant the chains were breaking. The silence was no longer safe. Kyle's breath shook as he realized the Fleet had not been destroyed in an ordinary battle. They had stumbled into the prison of something older than galaxies. The team returned to their ship shaken, but the discoveries burned inside them. They debated whether to share the truth or to hide. It liked the governments before them, but Kale knew hiding had never saved anyone. The truth was a wave that always rose higher. The whispers inside the static began again, louder, clearer, almost like words threading through their comms. Some voices sounded like soldiers begging for rescue. Others sounded like nothing human at all. Kale covered his ears, but the sound was already inside his head, pressing into his thoughts like claws. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, fragments of Kale's earlier recordings had already spread beyond control. More citizens were hearing the whispers in their homes, late at night, voices threading through comms units and even personal devices. Some dismissed it as paranoia. Others claimed the swarm was already reaching into their minds, searching for openings. Colonies erupted in fear. Riots broke out as people accused the government of hiding the threat, while leaders continued to deny everything, insisting the galaxy was safe. But fear needs no proof, and it grew. Heavier with every passing day, Kale's ship now carried more than fear. It carried proof: the carvings, the records, the warnings. He stared at the data blinking in his hands, knowing it was enough to expose the government forever, but it was also enough to paint a target on his back if they discovered what he carried. His team begged him to think carefully, but Kale had already decided the galaxy deserved to know the truth. The fleet had not vanished. Kale and his team left the dark expanse with their ship carrying more than artifacts, more than data. They carried a truth that could unravel the galaxy itself. The silence inside the corridors was heavy as each of them wrestled with the same fear. The records carved into the ancient station were clear. The silent swarm was not just a legend, it was real, and it was no longer chained. The fleet that had vanished had not been destroyed by weapons or war. They had been consumed, and their voices were now part of the whispers pressing into every frequency. Kyle sat in the command chair, staring at the console, where fragments of the recording still played, faint shadows moving across the screen, distorted faces of soldiers that no longer lived, begging for help in voices that twisted into something alien. By the time they crossed back into safer sectors, the whispers had already spread further across the galaxy. Hidden transmissions leaked into underground networks. Families of the vanished. Fleet heard echoes of their loved ones inside the static, calling for them to listen, calling for them to remember. Kale uploaded fragments of the station's carvings into private channels, and though he tried to limit access, the files escaped into the wild. Within hours, citizens across colonies were staring at the drawings of the silent swarm, old warnings about a hunger that moved from star to star, and people demanded answers louder than ever. The protests outside Central Command turned into full riots as crowds shouted that the government had lied from the beginning and would rather watch colonies burn than admit the truth. The leaders of the galaxy gathered in secret, once again, their faces pale behind closed doors. Some called for Kale to be hunted and silenced permanently, while others admitted it was already too late. The recordings had been seen, the whispers had been heard, and every attempt to deny them only made the citizens more certain the truth was being buried. But what frightened the leaders most was not the riots or the loss of trust. It was the data itself. The records clearly stated the swarm had been chained, sealed away long ago, and now the signs suggested the chains were breaking. If the swarm was loose, then every colony, every world, every star could be consumed. Kale watched the chaos unfold from hidden stations. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for long because he knew the government was hunting him. His team begged him to destroy the files before it was too late, but Kale refused because destruction meant silence, and silence was exactly what the swarm thrived upon in his mind. Silence was already its weapon, and hiding the truth would only prepare the galaxy for the same fate as the fleet. He made the decision to broadcast everything, not just fragments, not whispers, but the full recordings, the black box, the carvings, the ancient warnings. He prepared a signal powerful enough to reach across every colony, every ship, every station. When the broadcast hit the galaxy, it spread like fire. The image of the escort vessel burned from within the last transmission of a soldier screaming, "They are here." The carvings of the ancient station, showing stars, swallowed by darkness, and the words "silent swarm" repeated over and over again. Millions watched, and millions believed. Panic ignited like fuel protests, turned to open defiance, and ordinary citizens demanded war against the unseen enemy. Entire fleets prepared to mobilize without even knowing where to strike. Kale had hoped for unity, but what he saw instead was fear mutating into rage. The government could not contain the reaction. They sent their own messages across the stars, warning that open war would be suicide. They claimed that the swarm was too vast, too alien, too dangerous to face with weapons. They said the only hope was to stay hidden, to remain quiet, to avoid attracting its attention. But the citizens had already chosen their path. They demanded action, demanded weapons, demanded vengeance, because to them, silence felt like surrender, and surrender was the same as death. Kyle listened to the broadcasts with a heavy heart, his name spoken as both a savior and a traitor across different worlds. Some hailed him as the one who revealed the truth. Others cursed him for bringing panic and tearing the galaxy apart. But he knew the truth was not his enemy. The real enemy was still out there, waiting in the darkness, watching as the galaxy tore itself into pieces with fear and anger. One night, as he drifted in a quiet sector, Kyle listened to the static once again. The voices inside were clearer than ever now, and what he heard froze his blood, because among the whispers he no longer heard only soldiers crying for help. He heard something deeper, something vaster, like an ocean of voices merging into one. The sound was not a plea. It was a promise, and the promise was simple. We are coming. Kale shut his eyes and felt the weight of a terrible understanding spread through him. The fleet had not been the end of the story. They had only been the beginning. The silent swarm was awake, and the galaxy had already called out to it louder than ever. Kale's ship drifted into the dead star system at the very edge of the expanse, guided by the last known coordinates of the vanished fleet. The journey had been long and dangerous, and his small crew was exhausted, but none of them could speak of turning back. They had seen too much, heard too much. The whispers were no longer faint. They were strong, flowing through their comms like rivers of static. Each voice layered upon another, some sounding like the lost soldiers, some sounding like children, some so alien that even hearing them twisted the mind. Kale pressed his hands against the viewport as the system unfolded before him, and his heart dropped into silence. The star at the center was dead, its light stripped away, leaving only a black husk floating in darkness. No warmth, no energy, as though life itself had been consumed. Planets that once orbited it were reduced to frozen rocks, torn open and hollow, their surfaces cracked like shattered glass. Around the broken worlds floated the remains of ships twisted, hulls drifting with no fire, no sound, no life. Kyle recognized the insignias painted across their ruined sides. The vanished fleet was here, their proud warships reduced to shadows, their formations scattered like bones across a graveyard. The salvagers aboard whispered prayers while the scientists stared in horror, scribbling notes that made their hands tremble. Kale led them aboard one of the larger wrecks. The corridors were empty, but not silent. Faint echoes vibrated through the walls, voices, repeating again and again the final moments of the crew, sometimes screaming, sometimes whispering words that could not be understood. Consoles flickered with dying light, revealing logs that had not yet been erased. Kyle forced himself to open the last surviving record, and the voice of the fleet commander filled the air, raw, cracked, desperate. The commander spoke of how the fleet had found the swarm not as an attacking enemy, but as a wounded creature hiding in the silence trying to remain. Unseen, they had approached it thinking their weapons could study or contain it. But the swarm had reached into them not to kill, but to consume their fear, their minds, their energy, and as it fed the fleet's own weapons and engines drained themselves, powerless against something that had no form, no body, no weakness. The commander's last words trembled with realization. The swarm was not the true threat. It was hiding from something else, something greater, something older. The message ended with static, but not before the commander whispered a final warning. "We are only the first." Cale shut the log with shaking hands and felt the weight of the truth crash over him. The fleet had been devoured not as prey, but as silence to cover the movement of what was truly coming. The swarm was running from another force, and now that force was awake, Cale turned to his crew and saw the fear in their eyes. No words were needed because each of them felt it too. The shadows outside the viewport shifted. As if something vast was stirring beyond the graveyard of ships, space itself seemed to bend and pulse, not with the presence of the swarm, but with something that dwarfed it entirely. Across the galaxy, Kyle's broadcast had already spread colonies. Armed fleets prepared governments fractured into factions, each arguing over whether to fight or hide, but none of them understood the true scale of what was coming. Kyle knew he had to send this final warning, even if it destroyed him. He activated. His transmitter patched into every open frequency and spoke with a voice that shook, not with fear, but with urgency. He told them of the dead system of the wrecks of the commander's last message. He told them the swarm was real, but not the only. Danger and his final words were carried across the stars. The fleet never returned, because they were the first warning. As his signal echoed outward, Cale felt the air aboard his ship grow colder. The whispers in the comms grew into a roar. Thousands of voices overlapping, drowning every sound. The walls trembled as if the void itself was pressing against them. The scientists screamed. The salvagers tried to shut the systems down, but Kyle only stood still, his eyes locked on the viewport. Because outside in the dead system beyond the broken fleet, he saw movement, something stirring behind the dark horizon. Not a ship, not a creature, but a shape too vast for his mind to measure. Stars bent around it, light itself stretched and vanished in its presence. The roar of whispers cut into one final silence. And for a heartbeat, Cale understood that the galaxy was standing at the edge of something it could never defeat. The swarm had only been a shadow of the true force, a prisoner running from. Its master now, the master had awakened, and was turning its gaze upon the living stars. Cale whispered to himself, and to anyone who might still be listening across the void, "This is the beginning.